Hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Understanding User Management in Sequence Kinetics, ADSS and Permissions. I'm Ellie Stutz, Head of Knowledge and Collaboration for PNMsoft. Now think about your current BPM project. Do the right users have access to the right processes? Are users who shouldn't have access to confidential information blocked? Defining permissions plays a key role in a successful BPM implementation, especially in situations where data and processes are sensitive. Today, we'll show you how to define permissions according to best practices. We'll also demonstrate how to easily synchronize your Active Directory with Sequence using ADSS. Today's webinar will be presented by Mickey Cohen, the head of PNMsoft's Global Support Team. You're welcome to ask questions during this webinar. Just enter your questions into the GoToWebinar Questions widget, and we'll answer as many as we can at the end of each section. Mickey, it's great to have you here today. Over to you.
Thank you, Ellie, for that introduction, and welcome everyone to today's webinar. I'm happy to be hosting this webinar today. Like Ellie said, we'll be discussing two main issues in sequence kinetics today. One is the permissions and synchronizing users from your Active Directory into your sequence kinetics environment. This is what we'll be discussing on the permissions. We'll discuss what permissions are in sequence, how they work. We'll see what's the difference between permissions on the activity level and permissions on the workflow level. We'll see the differences between user-specific permissions and department or group permissions. Role permissions, what are public and Cascade? What do permissions have to do with the BRS, the background runtime service? A little bit about administrative permissions, and then we'll cover some best practices for permissions. I'll pause for a demo on each of these subjects. Then we'll proceed to ADSS, the Active Directory Synchronization Service, what it is, how it works, how to set it up and configure it, a little bit about LDAP queries and paths for querying your Active Directory. We'll have a demo and, of course, also cover some best practices. So we're going to start with permissions. Very important thing to remember is that permissions in sequence are not like permissions in Windows. It doesn't work the same way. So when you're thinking of granting permissions in your workflow, don't think Windows, think sequence. Sequence has 4 permission levels. Either the user does not have access, has read-only access, read-write full control. We'll cover what each of those mean. There are 2 types of permissions for the activity and for the workflows, and permissions can also be shared. Now, the combination of these 3 settings will basically define what the user is trying to access the workflow will see and what they'll be able to do. Now, permissions are basically required only for workflow level, human activities, and listener activities. Of course, there's no harm if you grant permissions on other activities, but most of the times it doesn't really have an effect or any need. So we're going to start with going over what activity permissions mean and what workflow permissions mean. I'm going to go back to this slide in a moment. I'll start with demoing how this works. Before we get into the actual demo, I'll just quickly show you the organization I'll be working with today. This is my organization tree. I have a fictitious company called Factory One with 4 locations in Portugal and in the UK. And this is my hierarchy. I hope you can see the entire tree. Now, I'm logged in as the system administrator, who's a global administrator, and of course also a developer on this environment. And I'm going to open this workflow. Now, before we get into the actual permissions, an important thing to remember that even though I'm running on debug mode and I'm running this as a global administrator, I still, if I want to run the workflow and debug one of the instances, I will still need permissions to do that. If I don't have permissions, I will not be able to do that. So I have a very simple basic workflow here that starts with 1 form and then 2 consecutive tasks. This task will be assigned to the recipient selected here, and then this task will be assigned to the creator of the workflow. Starting with granting permissions on the workflow level, I'll be granting read and write permissions on this workflow for this user, only on the workflow level. I'm not propagating these permissions to the activities below. And there you go. I've granted these permissions. Now I'll grant permissions for the person I'm going to select as a recipient of this task. And I'll also be granting read and write, so the user will also be able to complete the task. Looking at flow time, as the user that I've granted workflow level permissions, looking at the business processes page, I can now see this workflow. I can create new instances. If I only had read permissions, I wouldn't be able to create new instances of this workflow. So I'm going to fire up an instance of this workflow. Since I don't have permissions on the activities, I'm only receiving a message saying that the workflow was successfully created. As you can see, my tree view is completely empty. I don't see any of the activities, and that's because I only have permissions on the workflow level. Now, let's change that so I will be able to take action on the activities. I'm going back to the workflow, setting permissions, and this time I will be propagating to activities, and now I will have permissions on all the activities in the workflow. Going back to flow time, I will open the process page. As the originator of this workflow, I can also see this in my open processes, but I've opened the specific process page for this workflow. I can now see this workflow here. Opening the workflow, I can now see the form that I couldn't see before. I will select the recipient for this task, for the next task based on this workflow. The task was created. Now, I have read and write permissions with this user on all the workflow and the activities. I can see the task for the other recipient, but I only get read-only permissions, even though I have read and write permissions on the activity. That's because I'm not the recipient of this task. If I open this task now as the recipient, as you can see, I'm logged in as this user right now, I will be able to see the task in my inbox, open it, and as this user, I'm also able to complete the task that's been assigned to me. I submit the task. As you can see, again, because I don't have permissions on the other activities, I cannot see them in the tree view. I only see the activities that I have permissions for in the tree view here. Moving back to the other user, I'll open this workflow again. I can see the task. I can see what was entered in the task. But again, I only have read-only permissions on this task because, first of all, it's been completed, and second, it's not assigned to me. What I'll do next is I'll grant full control for this user over the workflow and all the activities. Propagate to activities, continue. Now this user has full control over the workflow. I'll open the workflow again. As you can see, I now have full control. Full control is very, very, very powerful. If at all, it should be restricted to a few users for extreme cases, because it allows you to change things in the workflow after the workflow has progressed. I can see that this form was already submitted, but I can change the value of any of the fields in this form. This is very powerful. I can also submit tasks on behalf of other people. This is the full control on the task level, on the activity level. I can do it on behalf of someone else, and I can submit something that's already been completed. Now, full control on the workflow level means I can abort workflows. I can roll back workflows, and I can also delete workflows. Again, very, very powerful permissions. should only be given to very specific users and for only specific cases, mostly if you need to roll back a process or something similar. So let's recap what we've seen. When you grant permissions on the activity level, it affects what you see on the tree view, and it affects what you can do on that activity. Obviously, if you have no access, you can't do anything. If you have read, you can only view the activity instance, like we saw when the activity was completed. Read and write, you can view and submit the activities, but as we've seen, tasks are an exception to that. If you have read and write on the task, it doesn't mean you can complete it. It has to be assigned to you for you to be able to complete it. Full control allows you to do everything, including submitting on someone else's behalf, resubmit, and add recipients to tasks, even if that option is not enabled on the task. For the workflow level permissions, read, you can view the workflow instances basically on the grids on the flow time like we've seen on this demo. Read and write, you can view and create workflow instances, and full control, as we've seen, gives you a lot of other powerful actions you can take, like aborting, rolling back, and deleting workflows. User and group permissions. Rule of thumb, don't grant specific user permissions. It won't really serve the purpose of your workflow. You can't really name the specific users that are going to be used later on in the process. Tasks might be assigned to users depending on what happens on the workflow. So don't use specific user permissions. We'll be mostly using group level permissions and also role-based permissions, which we'll cover later on. When you grant a specific group permissions, you're granting the same permission to everyone in that group. You can also propagate permissions when you're setting them to subgroups of that group. And setting permissions on group allows sharing using the public attribute, which is also something that we'll cover later on in the demo. Let's see what it means to grant group level permissions. I'm going to start by removing the permissions I previously granted for specific users, so we can start fresh. Okay, I'm going to grant permissions over the entire workflow and the activities. Switch to departments, which means basically groups. Select this group that I'm going to be granting permissions for. Using read and write, I won't propagate to subgroups. I will propagate to activities and apply the permissions. Now switching back to flow time. This user is a member of the group that I just granted permissions for. I can create a new process. Oh, sorry. I'll create a new process. Now let me try this again with the other user. Okay, here we go. Oh, sorry about this. I think I'm having some issues with my server.
Just as we're waiting for that to resolve, I just want to encourage people to ask your questions in the questions widget of the GoToMeeting interface. I see we actually already have a question or two, so we'll take those at the end of each section, first on permissions and then on ADSS. Mickey, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm here, just trying to work out what the problem is.
Okay. While you're doing that, I'll mention that this webinar and all of our webinars are available on our Knowledge Center at members.pnmsoft.com. And in order to, maybe I'll actually, Mickey, do you want me to show them where the recorded webinars are available while you resolve that?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so I'll just take it over to myself for a second.
Sure.
Hold on a second. Okay, so we'll just go into the Knowledge Center for a second, and this is our Knowledge Center, members.pnmsoft.com, and a lot of amazing resources on sequence here, user guides, videos, how-tos, and so on. And to go to our webinars page, you'll see that we have all of our latest webinars and all of our webinars in the last couple of years, actually. So you can just view them right from here, and you can see audience relevance and the category and the version, so it's all right there. One last little promo here is for our community. We have an amazingly active sequence community where you can ask and answer questions on sequence topics, and you can add tips, and our product team very actively monitors the questions here and answers them quite promptly. So I encourage you to visit the Sequence Connect community and start a new topic and join in the conversation.
All right.
Are we okay?
Sorry to interrupt. Yeah, we're back. It was just some SharePoint hiccup.
Okay, I'm going to make you the presenter again, and we'll take it right back to you, Mickey. Okay, can you share your screen?
Yeah, sure. Coming up.
Great.
All right, so back to what we were doing before. I logged in as this user, who is a member of the Lisbon Engineers group, created a new workflow instance, and I'm going to assign this task to another member of the same group. As you can see, as opposed to the previous time, I can now see the entire workflow and all the activities. Again, tasks that are not assigned to me, I will only be able to view in the read-only mode. And switching back to the user the task was assigned to, I'll be able to complete the task. Note that I don't see the entire workflow, although I have granted permissions for this user on the entire workflow. I'm only seeing the task that was specifically assigned to me. I'll complete this task, and it goes away from my inbox. Now, I'd like to show something a little different. I am going to grant permissions for another group on this workflow. I'm going to grant this executives group also read and write permissions on this workflow and propagate to activities. I'll create a new instance of the workflow. And assign the task to one of the members of that group. Again, note that I can still see the task. I'll have a look at flow time as that user. This is the user that I assigned the group, that I assigned the task for. I can see the message in my inbox. Don't confuse the message with the actual task. When I try to open the task, I can't open it. I don't have the permissions for it. This is part of the sharing option that I mentioned earlier, and I'll also be demoing this later on. The reason for this is that a workflow is only being shared if you have a relationship with the creator of the workflow. This is very essential. Because these users are in different groups, the permissions are only for that specific group. You cannot see workflows or activities between groups unless the specific settings have been applied. There are two mechanisms to deal with that. And one of those mechanisms, let me just go back to my presentation, is the role, the process role option. There are two types of roles. There is the creator role and recipients. and it can be used to assign workflow or activity level permissions. So to make sure that the recipients of tasks have the correct permissions that they need in order to complete the task, use process role. On that task, I will add permission not for a user, not for a group, but for a process role. I can select the recipient of the task and provide read and write permission. I'll grant the permissions. Now I'll switch back to the user that previously tried to open the task, although he allegedly had the permissions, but because he didn't share the same group, he couldn't open it. And now the user will be able to open the task and complete it. Moving back to the presentation, this is what the process role will give you. Public and Cascade, these are the sharing options for the workflows and activities. Now, these are only valid if you're using groups. There are no public and Cascade settings applicable for specific users or for process roles. Now, public indicates that members of the same group have visibility over each other's workflow instances. Let me just quickly show you. Here, I'm logged in as the Spawn Engineer 4. I can only see workflows that have been created by this specific user. If I switch to the other user, the Spawn Engineer 3, can only see workflows created by this user. But if I want to see each other's workflows, I'm going to have to change the permissions I granted this group and set public property to true. I'll apply the permissions, move back to flow time. Now I can see the workflows from all members of this group. As you can see, both see each other's workflows. And also, when I open a workflow, I can now see the entire workflow and not just what was applicable for me. As for Cascade, Cascade is only valid when public is enabled. If you set Cascade, any of the Cascade settings, and public is not enabled, then it will not be applied. It allows members of other groups to see instances from upper or lower and or lower groups. These are the Cascade options. Remember that when you define Cascade, it sets what the current group will see, not what group will see this current group. So when you're setting Cascade, it defines which groups you will see. So as an example, let's say the executives who are in a hierarchy that are above the engineers will need to see their workflow instances. If I go to the process page, currently I will not see any processes. However, if I go back to my workflow, I change the permissions for the executives group. Of course, I have to select public, otherwise Cascade will not be applied. And I want to see workflows for the lower groups. I will apply the permissions. I will switch back. And now I can see workflows created by employees, by users of any group that is lower in the hierarchy from the current group. Some examples of when you can use public, Cascade, and all the sharing option mechanism. For example, if you have a ticketing system or a bug system, this is ideal for sharing because normally you'd want people from the same group to see each other workflows. So the public setting would be ideal for that. Another example for expense report. If employees apply expense reports as their workflow, as the process, then you don't want sharing enabled between people and allow them to see each other's expense reports. So we will not enable public for such a workflow. However, you would like the managers to see workflows of the employees. So the managers will be higher in the hierarchy, and you will allow public and Cascade to lower groups, allowing the managers to see the expense reports of the employees. Now, a few words about the background runtime service and permissions. This is only valid for the database listener activity. The identity that's running the background runtime service needs to be an active user in sequence. Otherwise, it won't be able to perform any of the tasks. But there's only one scenario that you'll actually need to grant permissions for that user for it to be able to execute the activity, and that is the database listener. If the database listener is starting the workflow, you'll need to grant read and write permissions not only on the database listener activity, but on the workflow as well. If you have a database listener anywhere else in the workflow, then read and write permissions on that activity alone will be enough for the BRS to execute the database listener. So far, we've discussed the permissions inside workflows, but there are other roles and permissions inside sequence. For example, on the administration side, permissions can be granted on various tables in the administration side to make management of other tables very, very easy. Just by right-clicking on the table, you can set permissions on that table and grant employees permissions to actually log into the administration site, and they will only see the tables that they are allowed to manage. Now, global administrator and developers are not permissions. I mentioned this earlier on. These are only roles that are relevant for the administration site only. Basically, if you're asking yourself what's the difference between global administrator and developer, basically global administrator will see everything here. Developers will only see workflows and categories. Of course, unless they've been granted specific permissions for any of the other tables. What are group managers? Group manager is also not a permission. It's just a role. The role allows other actions not on the administration side, but on flow time as well. It allows you to view messages for all group members using the My Group Messages web part. It allows the group manager to add members to his own group and perform delegations on behalf of group members. So if someone from that group is on leave or on vacation or for some reason cannot complete his own task, the group manager can perform delegation to another member of the group using the delegation option. Let's go over a few permissions best practices. Always include permission planning in your workflow design. When you're working on a workflow, try to think of how you will be granting permissions on that workflow, how you'd like to build the groups around the workflow so it will be easier for you to grant the permissions. Use group and role permissions only. Don't use named users. It will make it very, very hard for you to manage the permissions. As you saw, role permissions are very powerful, very useful, makes life a lot easier for you. For tasks, always give the recipient role read and write permissions to ensure that they can always complete the tasks and avoid any problems with permissions on tasks. Use process roles when the participants are dynamic, when tasks are assigned based on a process role or an expression or something like that. Make sure you use process roles. Again, it will make your life a lot easier. For administrators and developers, there are a lot of times they need to debug processes and be able to see all the open instances using the debugger. Best practices for that, put the admins on top of the entire organization and give them read and write permissions, cascade down, and they will be able to debug any instances. So whenever a user says, I have a problem with this workflow instance, you'll be able to open it and debug it very quickly. A quick trick that was added in one of the more recent versions is that you can inherit workflow permissions on an activity just by right-clicking and selecting Inherit Workflow Permissions. So if you have permissions on the workflow level and you just quickly apply it to the activities rather than just opening the activity and assigning permissions one by one. All right, that concludes the permissions part of the webinar. Ellie, do we have any questions?
Yeah, Mickey, great. A couple questions. Peter is asking, with group permissions, can one member of the group fetch a task from another member who has already fetched it? So one member fetches the task, and then another member tries to fetch it from him, and they both have permissions because they're in the group. Can the second one do that?
Well, only full control. Only if they have full control. Only users
I guess that's an example of
can complete tasks on behalf of other people and also fetch and return tasks for the entire group.
So I guess that's an example of why full control is a bit risky, and best practice probably not to use it where possible.
Yes.
Second question I have from Jacob here. If you give permissions to a group that is synced from Active Directory, I assume only users who are active in sequence are able to effectively use those roles. What if we wanted all users in an Active Directory group to automatically become active so our security team can manage the users via Active Directory only, other than using an SQL trigger to manage it? I know that's a bit of an advanced question there. Do you have a comment on that, Ricky?
I'm not sure I fully understood the entire question, but any user that's active in the Active Directory and with ADSS set up to sync those users, active users in Active Directory will become active in sequence. Any users that are not active in sequence won't be able to see any of the workflows. They will simply not be authenticated. So I'm not sure I'm getting the question correctly. So, Jacob, I can try and maybe get in touch with you after the webinar to fully understand what you need to accomplish.
Okay. One more question, Mickey. What's the best way for someone to see a bird's eye view of permissions in a process? Over the whole process, who has what permission?
Okay, that's a good question. First of all, you can view permissions not only when you're looking at the App Studio. You can also view permissions from the administration window as well. You can simply right-click and view the current permissions. You can set permissions directly on a specific workflow, but if you'd like to see what permissions a specific user has, you should be able to do this from here. If you go to resource management here, you will see the permissions that this group has on this window here. So if, for example, I'm going to go to, I think I granted permissions for this group, go to resource management, I can see that on this workflow they have read and write, public, lower groups, and I can also modify the permissions from here. I can also grant permissions from here.
Okay.
So I hope this answered the question.
Definitely. And can you just show us the screen for like the manage permissions screen again for a specific process? Just to review that, just so people know how to see the kind of a summary of who has what permissions on that process.
Yeah, of course. Again, when you're right-clicking a workflow space, you can view the permissions of the active workflow. If you have multiple versions and you want to view permissions on a specific workflow, you just right-click on it, and you can select Manage Permissions. This will give you the details of the workflow level permissions, as you can see from here. If you'd like to see permissions for a specific activity, you'll just need to go over to that activity, right-click, and select Set Permissions.
Very good. Okay. We actually have quite a few questions. Do you have time for another couple here? Or
yeah, sure.
Okay, so Andy is asking, is there a way to set permissions on a data field level so that some controls may be hidden if someone does not have the right permissions?
No, that's not on the permission scope. You'll have to do that as part of the form that you build. You can use sequence expressions or other various options if you want to hide or show based on specific user, but that's not part of the permission scope.
Okay. Okay, that's all the time we have for questions on permissions. If we have more time, we'll maybe try to get back to another one that's come in. I guess back to you, Mickey, for the second section of this webinar on ADSS.
Yes, thank you, Ellie.
Okay.
All right. So Active Directory synchronization. ADSS, this is a question that came up a lot. It does a one-way sync. It only pulls users from, actually not just users, various objects from your Active Directory or Active Directories, if you have more than one, into sequence kinetics. It makes it a lot easier for you to manage your user if you're actively using Active Directory. It makes user management in sequence a lot easier. Supported objects that you can synchronize from your Active Directory in sequence are domains. Domains are basically just containers in sequence, just as groups and OUs, and users. So you cannot use contact objects or computer objects. These are not relevant for sequence, so these are not being synchronized. Users are, if you're looking at the database, they're being stored in the employees table, and domains, groups, and OUs are in the organization, TBL organization table. If you set up multiple ADSS instances, if you install this service on multiple servers, they're automatically being configured for failover. One thing that you have to remember if you're doing this is to make sure the settings, the configuration files, are synchronized in terms of the synchronization settings. ADSS supports synchronizing from multiple domains. We'll see, we've seen this screenshot before. We'll go back to it a little bit after. So you can see how you can easily synchronize from multiple domains. Another great option from ADSS is it can execute code from the custom code that you wrote before and or after each synchronization cycle. So if you want to do everything, something specific every time a sync starts or ends, you can easily do that. We'll quickly go over how to configure it. After you've installed ADSS, the service itself will be stopped. You'll need to set it up before you start it and initialize the synchronization. So log into your administration site and manage the organization, under Manage Organization widget, just click on Active Directory Settings. Let's quickly do this now. I have cleaned up my organization. As you can see now, I should have a clean organization. So I'll quickly just show you the Active Directory that I'm going to be using. All right, this is my Active Directory. If you recall, Factory1 was the name of my organization, which I synchronized, and basically I synchronized all these OUs and the users inside. So how do I set it up? Back to my administration site. Just close up a few things. Clicking on Active Directory Settings will bring up the first configuration window. The first thing I need to set up is the domains that I'm going to be synchronizing. I hit Edit, and I type the name of my domain. Use NetBIOS name, all right, and set credentials. Setting credentials for querying the Active Directory, you have to make sure that these are valid credentials for the domain you're going to be synchronizing. If you're checking the Use Default Credentials checkbox, that means that the identity running the Windows service will be the one querying the Active Directory. In my case, it's all in the same domain, so I will be using this option here. After I configure the domains, I can add additional domains from here. I need to configure the filters that I'm going to use. First, I'll set up the path. In my case, I would like to synchronize the factory one OU. So I'll be setting this path and set the filter. Now these are all LDAP syntax. There are quite a lot of articles on this on the web on how to use the LDAP path and filters. I'll provide you with some resources at the end of the webinar. This is my filter. Basically, I have an OR operator here. I'm looking for domains, users, organizational units, and groups. Insert, update, and delete. These checkboxes define how the synchronization will behave. If you check only insert, then it will only import users and that'll be it. So it will only check for new objects matching your criteria. If you enable also update, then any changes on the Active Directory will also reflect on sequence. Delete indicates that if an object is no longer found, meaning moved outside of the scope or deleted, it will become inactive in sequence. Very important. Users are never deleted from sequence to maintain data integrity. Groups and OUs can be deleted, but not users. So I've gone ahead and configured my filter. On the next screen, I can define which other Active Directory user attributes I'd like to synchronize into sequence. So everything that is checked and grayed out means this is a required attribute for sequence. Anything else I'd like to sync, I can just select it and it will sync. For example, if I'm using a field called employee ID, I can check it here and that will also be synchronized into my sequence environment. After I'm done setting all the attributes I'd like to synchronize, I simply hit finish and I'm ready to go. Next thing I need to do is simply start the Active Directory service, synchronization service. So back to my Windows services, you can see the Active Directory synchronization service stopped. I'm going to start it now and let it synchronize. Just going to give it a few seconds. Go back to my administration site, hit Edit Organization, and as we can see, users are already being populated with the OUs, groups, anything that matched my criteria. So as you saw, it's very, very, very easy to set it up, get it up and running, and start synchronizing your users from Active Directory. So again, just to quickly recap what we've done, we've set up domains, paths, filters, defined domains and the identities to query the domains, set up the paths. Again, think of your Active Directory as some sort of database that you're just running a query on. The path defines where you're going to search, basically which OU you're going to be using as your scope for the search, and the filter is the search criteria. Very important, always test your filters before completing the configuration on sequence. We've covered the insert, update, and delete option. Additional attributes, if you're wondering where these will show up, they will be populated into TBL employees on the sequence database. After you complete the setup, this is part of the installation screen. These are configurations for ADSS. We'll cover a few tips later on. Important settings for the Active Directory that you can apply on the configuration file for ADSS are start sync loop and stop sync loop. You can define specific times for the ADSS to run. A little bit about paths and queries. What we've covered. Again, think of your AD as just a database that you're querying. I will publish these links that give you great guides on how to use LDAP, the syntax, basics of LDAP queries. Very, very useful links that will make it easy for you to write the exact query that you need. And we've done a quick demo of how to synchronize, but I also want to show you a few common scenarios that I've seen with several clients. What we've done is we've synchronized based on OU. We've set the scope for this OU, and we've just synchronized everything. Now, what if you'd like to synchronize something else? You don't want to synchronize everything inside an OU. You'd like to have a specific group, a security group that you set up on your Active Directory, and you only want these users to show up in sequence. So it's just a matter of writing the correct filter. An easy way to test your filters is on Active Directory users and computers. Wherever you stand, when you click on the search option, that will come up as the root of the search. That's actually the LDAP path. Switch to custom search and to advanced, and you can simply paste your filter here, and this will return the result. So this is a very quick and easy way to test your filters before implementing them on sequence. What I've done here is I've looked for an object called sequence, and every user that's a member of, or actually any object that's a member of this group. Again, I'm not going to go into all the details of how to use LDAP queries. This is all covered in the articles that you saw in the presentation. So what I've done here is basically I took this group called sequence and also searched for all the members of that group. So that's an easy way if you'd like to synchronize only members of specific groups. You can also search on Active Directory based on specific attributes. So on this query, I'm looking for users whose department is engineering, and I'm only getting the engineering department users. If we have a quick look at this user, we can see that department is engineering. So this covers really basic scenarios I've seen when people are trying to use ADSS to only bringing specific users. All right, a couple of best practices. On our member site that Ellie showed you before, we have a guide for the Active Directory, a lot more detailed than what we've covered, but obviously we've covered all the basics. Again, as we mentioned, always test your filters. It's very important. We recommend running ADSS off hours, so it doesn't interfere with the work, especially if you have a large organization. You're synchronizing a lot of users in the sequence. When synchronizing group and their members, set path to the root of the domain. You might have members of the group in different areas, different OUs, not necessarily under the same OU. So if you set the search to the root of the domain, you're definitely going to catch all the members of the group. Before making any changes in Active Directory synchronization, we recommend making a backup of your database. It's just that once you've added users, as I've mentioned, you cannot delete. You don't want to run into trouble after your first sync, so make a backup. And periodically check the Panam log on the event viewer for sync errors. If for whatever reason someone doesn't know where to find it, on the server where the service is installed, you can simply open the event viewer. And under application and services logs, you will find the Panam log, which is created with every installation of sequence. It doesn't matter if it's just service or flow time or administration. You will have the log there. If there are any errors during synchronization, they will come up in the log. Of course, if you're having problems resolving the problems, go ahead and contact support, and someone will assist you with that. All right, this is the log. All right, do we have any questions on ADSS?
Yes, we do, Mickey. That was great. Andrea is asking, if users are removed from Active Directory, how does Sequence deal with it? Does it automatically disable those users who are no longer in the latest sync, or is that a manual process?
No, that's not a manual process, but that also depends on how you manage your users. If the user came from ADSS, and the user is now not coming up on the filter anymore, it doesn't necessarily mean it was deleted, it's just not coming up on the filter anymore, then Sequence will set the user inactive, and the user will not be able to log into Sequence anymore.
Okay, Joni is asking, ADSS syncs one time per day or a different duration?
It just depends on how you schedule it. It has an interval that you can set in a number of minutes, but the sync will only run if it's during the scheduled times. If you haven't scheduled it, then it will run after each interval. But if you've scheduled it for specific hours, then it will only run during these hours in every interval that you've configured. The ADSS guide that's on the member site covers all the options, all the settings, and a few recommendations as well.
Okay, we have a couple other questions. Some of these might be a little bit advanced, but let's see. Peter is asking, can you give an example of setting start sync loop in the ADSS config file?
Yes, of course. Absolutely. It's very easy. First of all, when you install ADSS, it's going to be you can select the path that you would like to install it on when you run the installer. By default, it's under Program Files, PNM Soft, Active Directory Synchronization Service, and here's the config file. All right, the config file itself has a little bit of help on what you can configure, as you can see from here. Scrolling to the right, as you can see, start sync loop, stop sync loop. This is in 24-hour format, if I recall correctly, but this is definitely documented in the guide. As far as I remember it, this is 24-hour format, so if I wanted to run, let's say, between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. only, this is how I'll configure it. Save the config file. Don't forget, after making changes to the configuration file, you have to restart the service to apply the changes.
Okay.
Right.
Okay, I have another question here.
Sure.
From Mark, is there a way to get all Active Directory users into TBL employees, but only a subset of those in an Active Directory group, perhaps, to be active in TBL employees?
I'm not really sure I fully understood the question, but an active user on Active Directory that's being synced into Sequence will be active on Sequence. If you want to have users that are basically active in Active Directory, put them in the Sequence and then just disable some of them, the next run of ADSS will enable them again because it's enabled on Active Directory. There are various ways around that. If you'd like to look into that, please drop an email over to support and we'll see what exactly scenario you need and we'll be able to assist.
Okay. Jacob is asking, what is the best way to handle tasks assigned to people that become deactivated in Sequence? Well,
that actually depends on the scenario. you could use delegation and then make sure someone can log in as a different user. But the best way, I think, would be to make sure that, you know, if a user is leaving the organization or being moved to a different group, make sure you check the existing processes and tasks for that user. But again, that kind of depends on the scenario. If the user is moving within the organization and is leaving the organization, or what exactly is the reason for that.
I guess that ties into best practice of not assigning permissions to a specific user, rather to role-based, so that you know.
Yeah, that depends. You could still assign a task for a group, but one of the group members is no longer an employee or has left the company and becomes inactive, or if it was assigned to him as part of a process role, still if he has permissions and he's not active, no one will be able to complete the task on his behalf. So you need to somehow reassign the task. You can come in as someone who has full control. This is actually a good scenario for someone who has full control, and just go in the task, reassign it to someone who is active and will be able to complete the task.
Okay. One last question. Nuno is asking about permissions. Is there some way of managing dynamic user permissions, meaning you need to grant permissions to a user not originally in the workflow without going into the admin portal?
Basically, process role is best for that. But again, this question is a little bit wide, so it also scenario specific. But process role is dynamic permissions. This is exactly the definition of it.
You can also, I think, in the runtime, you can like one user can add additional recipients on the fly, like as the process is running in production. That's a way of adding another user to a task or to a message in runtime, not in the admin portal.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, that's it for the questions. Mickey, I want to thank you very much. What a really wonderful and informative webinar on an extremely important topic. And we're going to have this webinar on demand, the recorded version on the Knowledge Center, members.pianosoft.com. So if you missed part of it or you want to share it with someone, you can just go straight to there. I think that's it for today. Thank you so much, Mickey, and thank you all for being with us. It's been a really wonderful webinar. Bye then.
Thank you, Ellie.
Bye, Mickey.